Hello, my name's Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and today I'm going to be continuing my discussion on the powers of the President of the United States in comparison with the powers of the United States Congress. Now, this discussion is, has become kind of critical at this point because of the invasion of Venezuela and the kidnapping of its incumbent president by U.S. forces as directed by 45th and 47th President Donald Trump on January the 3rd, 2026. And of course, President Maduro is in the United States, are currently facing criminal charges for drug trafficking. I've done videos showing how those actions violated international law. Also, the president used the military to invade Venezuela and, of course, kidnap its president without prior congressional approval or even notifying Congress in violation of the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution does say that it's Congress that has the power to declare war. So today, so but however, we see the president has not violated um, U.S. law concerning declaration concerning sort of arrogating Congress's power to declare war because he has ample precedent for that. Apparently, U.S. presidents have actually used military forces to wage war at least 125 times, over 125 times in our nation's history. So President Trump has ample precedent, right, um, with regard to that. Today, I want to avoid editorializing, but I want to be able to provide context and explain things I discuss. I've done numerous videos just trying to give a history of our nation and comparing events and providing historical facts. But I'm not going to just be giving an inventory of facts without also providing analysis, right? And helping to explain how our history has been unfolding. So today I'm going to try and frame this discussion in terms of I'll be framing the discussion concerning the powers of Congress vis-a-vis the U.S. president, the executive powers, um, in terms of the views of uh, James Madison, our fourth president, since he's often called the father of the U.S. Constitution. Of course, he was not the only drafter of the U.S. Constitution. However, it is just more convenient to frame the discussion in terms of his philosophy. And since this is a discussion of American presidents, so without a doubt, the framers of the Constitution intended that Congress would be the more powerful branch of government. Of course, that's why it itemizes the powers of Congress first before the executive powers. So uh, the powers of Congress are itemized, they're enumerated uh, in Article One, right? And then, of course, after that, Article Two defines the powers of the executive, and Article Three, the judiciary, right? Although, right, academically, all the branches of government are supposed to be equal and supposed to check one another. They have separate functions. However, we see a situation where it is Congress's power, it's Congress's function to declare war. We find that we have a president who's actually taking actions that are tantamount to declaring war. And besides, our presidents have taken us again to war over 125 times in our nation's history without actually uh, getting prior authorization from Congress. So it, we see there's some kind of overlap, going back and forth. But without a doubt, Congress is a more powerful organ of government. That was the intention of the framers. That was the intention of James Madison and our founding fathers, that Congress was to be the more powerful organ of government, and you can see it in the powers of Congress. Right, Congress has the ability to impeach and remove a president. So we see that several of our presidents have been impeached, but none has ever been successfully removed by Congress, because the final vote for removal in the Senate always fails. Right, so our first president to be impeached was Andrew Johnson. He was our 17th president, but he was acquitted by one vote. Right, the attempt to remove him from office failed by one vote. That was Andrew Johnson, our 17th president. I want to make sure I'm saying Andrew Johnson, not Andrew Jackson. And of course, Bill Clinton also has been impeached, but there was a failure to remove him as well. Of course, President Trump has been impeached twice in his first term, but of course, he was acquitted, and there was a failure to remove him from office as well. He's expressed recent fears that if he fails the midterms, that he will be impeached. We don't know. Again, my what I want to do with these videos is talk about history. I don't want to do journalism, right, with this. So that's very, very recent. Now, of course, present events are a result of historical facts. So it was in the intention of Congress, of our framers, to make Congress it was intention of our framers to make Congress the more powerful organ of government, to be more powerful than the executive. And again, I want to refer us to the fact I had a slip of tongue there by saying intention of Congress. The fact is, the Constitution, the organs were created by a constitutional convention. The constitutional convention is another name for Congress, right? These are words from Latin, right? And they mean the same thing. They're equivalent, right? So we call the Constitutional Convention in order to create a new constitution that could create a more powerful central government, right? That was in 1787. We prior to that, after the Revolutionary War, in which we gained our independence from Great Britain, we actually had we had we had the Articles of Confederation, right? So that was our first constitution as a nation, as an independent nation. We had the Articles of Confederation, and we had the was it the Congress of Confederation? Is that what we're called? But we didn't have an executive arm of government. We didn't have a judiciary, right? So we just had a legislative arm of government, which was weak. It didn't have the ability to collect money, to wage taxes. It states gave, they basically contributed to it. So the states saw themselves as independent, right? So we had what was called the League of Friendship. So they saw themselves as independent, like countries who were just working together. And the role of the United States, right, was to provide for common defense, right? Those were the main things, and then maybe postal services to facilitate, delivery of mail, because of course transportation was really primitive back then. I'm sorry to 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 place our founding fathers and the earlier periods in anachronistic terms, but yeah. So the what we had originally with the Continental Congress, or whatever it was called again, with the Articles of Confederation, was something very weak, and we had a unicameral um, legislative body, no executive branch, no judiciary. So it was, an assembly, Congress, called something else, Constitutional Convention, that now created the three arms of government through the Constitution of 1787, and um, the first organ of government that was listed, and was Congress, right? And it makes sense. I remember when I was in law school, um, our I had a professor who was teaching us how to write our exams, and she would point out that look, if you're answering things and you're going to enumerate points, arguments, put the most important in number one. If you put the most important in the last, right, at the end, concluding, right, you're telling me you don't know the significance, right? You really don't know what you're talking about. But if you put the most important argument right at the top, I'm following you. I understand that you understand the relationship of the arguments, right? So you see our founding fathers, most of whom were lawyers. James Madison never qualified as a bar, but but back then things were different. But he studied law on himself, on his own, right? He got the law curriculum from a friend. He got the books and he studied it on his own. And so he was a founding father, and he placed the most important function of government, right, in Article 1, right? So just like lawyers do, you place the most important, you lead with the most important argument, the most important item. And so, we can say logically, just because Congress is number one, is listed first. Our Constitution doesn't say Congress is the most powerful, but just logically, like if you're thinking about it, the fact that it's the first item on the list, then you can tell, well, this is the most powerful organ of government. And now I also want to use another analogy just to explain, because again, our constitution doesn't compare their powers, right? The objective academically is that they're all equal, they're co-equal, they share power, and they check one another for checks and balances, and their powers are separate. But I'm going to use the analogy of creation and religion. For those of us who are religious, religion is a big part of the founding of our nation, right? So when we think of Christianity and we think of God or other religions, I'm going to keep it simple, right? Christianity, when we think of God, um, the most powerful being is the one that creates, right? And that's God. So God created man, right? So the creator is considered to be the most powerful. So God is clearly more powerful than man. Man didn't create God, right? It's God who that in Christianity, in Judaism, in the Abrahamic religions, in Islam, their notion of God is that He is the creator. That He created human beings, He created the world, so He comes first. So you see, even in the Christian Holy Bible, it starts with the story of creation, how God starts to create the world and creates man. So He has more authority, He has more power, and you see in the functions of the Congress as well. One of the things Congress can do is to actually remove the president, as I was saying, right? And through impeachment, they can investigate the actions of the executive branch, right? The president doesn't have any power to authority to remove any member of Congress, right? Um, and also the fact that I've also I want to make an allusion also to employer-employee relationship. An employer is more powerful than an employee, even though both of them are in a contract, right? It's uh, it's an arm length. It's supposed to be. Oh, let me not say arm's length, not because it will be non-arm's length. When they're entering their initial contract, it's an arm's length contract because uh, they have equal bargaining power, right? Because the employees and employer will typically, and they can say no. They have a right to say no. So they come, they have their contract, they have an agreement, right? But who's more powerful in that relationship? Once the agreement is entered, the contract is entered, the employee abides by the rules of the employer, and the employer pays the employee. So we find in reality, the employer is actually more powerful than the employee. Now it's Congress that pays the president, right? It's Congress that funds the government. It's only Congress has the power to fund the government. If the president has a program, he goes to ask Congress, right, through appropriations. And it's interesting because this was what I studied. This was what I was trained for in in the federal government, right? So I have a law degree, but I haven't taken the bar. But funny enough, when I went to work for the federal government, they trained me and certified me in appropriations law, right? So I learned about how the federal government goes to get money from uh, Congress, right? So it's Congress that funds the government. It's Congress that has the power to raise an army, right? Or the Navy. They're the ones who have the power to coin money, to print money, to, right? They're the ones who have the power to tax. Those are the powers of Congress, not the president. So the president can advise, can make proposals. Congress has to approve them. And even if the president wants to appoint a member of cabinet or a judge or the chief justice, Congress has to approve them, right? So uh, the consent and advice of Congress is required. So Congress is the more powerful arm of government, right? So the one who pays your check, obviously, is more powerful than the payee, right? In the relationship, practically. Um, but something I want to point out though is even though that's the intent, we see uh, in practice, so things have not quite been the way intended, and maybe our framers intended it that way because remember our framers. I'm going to talk in specifically in terms of James Madison. James Madison was a student of the classics, right? He actually studied the classics. That's when you say you study the classics, you're studying the Greeks and the Romans. When we say Romans, we mean what we're studying is Latin. So that was the language of the Romans back then, Latin, right? Those areas were called the Latinate area. Um, James Madison was actually exceptional in Latin, right? So he studied them extensively and he would go and study old republics, Greek republics, and things like that. This was something, he was a nerd. This is what he did. He had an extensive library, over 4,000 books. And so he would peruse these things and study the ancients, their forms of government. So um, in some ways, you can see he was copying the Romans, right? He wanted to emulate the Romans. So while while we copied the Republic era of the Romans, right? The Romans had three forms, three eras of government. They had the regal period that was prior to 529 BC. They drove away their kings. The regal period was the time they had a monarchy. The Romans, till this day, they hate kings. I lived in Italy, went to school in Italy, so I know how um, Italians till today they hate kings, the notion of kings. So they drove away their kings in 529 BC, and they had the period of the Republic from 529 BC to 27 BC, when Caesar's great nephew, Augustus Caesar, actually Octavian, became emperor. Of course, it was Julius Caesar who started to break up the republic, right? By becoming a dictator, he making himself life dictator. He was a general and he made himself life dictator. So I'm going to finish up with that story, the story of the Romans, because our republic, our framers, they created the constitution and the organs of government, with the tapestry of the Roman forms of government, overshadowing. They were looking at the Romans, for guidance, right? But now I'm going to just quickly talk about what we had, uh, what we have on ground now. So anyway, I was quickly saying that yes, that during the Roman governments evolved, right? So they became a republic, and then eventually the Roman Empire started in 27 BC when they were ruled by an emperor, and the republic was no more, the Senate was no longer relevant. So in the period of the republic, they didn't have a king. The republic was made up of patricians, the senators, and they were all supposed to be equal. And so many people participated in government. Notionally, people voted. And then, of course, there was an executive function of government, which was a magistrate, right? And the magistrate's role was embodied in the consul. So the consul was picked from amongst the senators, right? Typically from amongst the senators. And the senators, they handpicked who would be consul temporarily, maybe for a period of 1 year, not to exceed 2 years. They could even pick two at the same time to divide their powers, their authority. And these were, and then they had an assembly that, just had a nominal vote, right? Rubber stamping what the senators did. So it was the senators who were the patricians who had more power. And so Julius Caesar had been one of these consuls. So these consuls are just temporary. One of the powers they have is, so they're magistrates. One of the powers they had back then was to, they could raise an army, right? And the Romans were known for wars and conquest. So they would go and conquer foreign lands. And of course, that was what Julius Caesar was doing when he went to conquer Gaul, and eventually he fell out with the Senate because of his genocide and his atrocities in Gaul. And they were, the senators were so horrified, and they wanted to withdraw the what they'd given him, the command. They told him to resign from his command. They wanted him to come back without his army so that they could prosecute him. That obviously meant death, but he refused, and the die was cast, as he said, and he crossed the Rubicon. The generals were not allowed to bring their soldiers into the city of Rome. Rubicon was a little, like just shallow river, not really a river, but maybe like a pond like thing. And but Caesar defied the senators and crossed with his army. So obviously the senators were more powerful. Power was supposed to be in the hands of the senators, but a very strong general. Caesar was a very strong, influential general. He was a patrician himself. He was a member of the patrician class, but he defied the republic, and he marched onto Rome, caused a civil war, made him he won, he became life dictator. So and I want to bring us back to today. So even though Congress, theoretically has more power than than the president, we've seen that Congress has been very willing in the past to um, let a very dynamic, strong-willed president act, right? To just, they've in fact ceded some powers and given him de facto legislative powers in many ways. For instance, um, the federal government, for instance, has many administrative agencies, and they create laws, right? They create laws specifically for running their agencies. And these powers have been delegated by Congress, to make, you know, implementation of laws convenient. So they use experts, right? For instance, when it comes to tax, the IRS, they have they create their laws and things like that. And for instance, we also have administrative judges, administrative law judges. They're not really judges, right? But because of the constraints of the judiciary, so you find that they're normally attorneys, and they have these ad hoc powers to decide matters with regard to their specific agencies. And, so these specific agencies also create laws for for running their specific agencies within the executive arm of government. So, and I've also talked about the war powers resolution and authorizations for the use of force that Congress, sort of used to allow the president to take limited military action for up to 90 days without seeking their approval, right? And presidents have used these powers extensively. Um, so we find that we're very fortunate that so are there concerns that we can have a president, or maybe President Trump can become like a Julius Caesar, right? And simply arrogate power to himself and overthrow disregard the powers of Congress and overthrow Congress and use an army against them? Well, first of all, President Trump does not lead an army. He's commander in chief, right? And technically the military answers to him. He's commander in chief, But President Trump was not a general like Julius Caesar was, who had his own army. Back then, in fact, the Romans during the time of Caesar, they didn't have a standing army, right? So patricians who had the money raised their own army. They funded their own armies by themselves. So Julius Caesar had uh, his own army. He was a wealthy man. He had his own private army, and so President Trump doesn't have that. We now have a standing army, right? So we're now post Augustus Caesar. It was after Julius Caesar was assassinated, and his great nephew eventually, won civil wars and then became the most powerful man in Rome. And then he became first emperor, even though he never used the title while he was alive because he didn't want to be assassinated like his great uncle. But he was the one who created a standing army, and he created the Praetorian Guard that was like a bodyguard that protected the emperor, that protected him, right? So yeah, apparently our President Donald Trump, no president has, uh, no President Trump does not he doesn't really control the army, right? He doesn't really control the army in that manner, in the way Caesar controlled the army. The armies in of Julius Caesar had personal allegiance and loyalty to him, right? They owed their loyalty, their allegiance to Julius Caesar directly. So that era has changed, right? Our military, even our federal employees, we take an oath not to the president, but to the United States Constitution, right? So that's one. If we ever had a general, a president who had the opportunity to do what Julius Caesar did, that would have been George Washington. Because George Washington, one, he was our first president, and he was the first commanding general. He commanded the military. The soldiers at that time had this personal allegiance and relationship, this emotional attachment and bond to George Washington. In fact, after the end of the Revolutionary War, because of the financial crisis America was plunged into, and the central government, we could not they could not pay the salary of the soldiers. The soldiers were owed money, so they attempted to mutiny. In fact, I think they did mutiny. And they wanted to make George Washington a military dictator. They wanted him to rule and lead an army and go and overthrow the government. And if the government the seat was in Philadelphia then. They wanted to go and overthrow the government and make George Washington, dictator. George Washington stopped them, read them a speech, and said no, that they overthrew tyranny, in the embodiment of Great Britain, and it would not make sense. It would not be proper for the soldiers to now replicate, after they had done a great deed, overthrowing tyranny, to now be themselves tyrannical. And so, the it was so the person we had as our first president, our first commanding general, he's the one who he was much more like a Cincinnatus. I've talked about Cincinnatus before. Um, he was like a Cincinnatus. He was humble with regard to his powers. He wasn't overly ambitious. His powers didn't go to his head, and so he refused to be king when they wanted to make him a king. He refused to be a dictator when his soldiers wanted to overthrow the government. He refused. He calmed them down. And when he was elected, he's the only president, well, to have been elected unanimously, right? And when he had two terms, he set the precedent and did not seek a third term. And he stepped aside, right? So just like in the manner of Cincinnatus, Cincinnatus was a Roman general and farmer who the Roman Senate would run to. The Romans would run to every time they were invaded, right? Whenever they were invaded, they'd give him dictatorial powers. And Cincinnatus would lead an army and he would defeat the invaders. And immediately he would resign his powers, his dictatorial powers, and go back to his farm, right? So that was Cincinnatus. And so, uh, you know, uh, George Washington, our first president, or who had the ability to be like a Julius Caesar, refused that, right? He wasn't overly ambitious, he was humble, he didn't have the hubris that Julius Caesar had. So that would have been the president might have had the ability to do that. And who else? Maybe Ulysses Grant, right? But Ulysses Grant didn't. So he'd Washington had set a precedent, and I think it's now in the mindset of Americans. It's part of our DNA that our leaders they govern with the consent, with our consent, right? Our government is governed with the consent of the government, right? You know, our rulers lead us uh, via our consent, right? They have to have the consent of the governed, right? So they can't dictate to us. So it will be very difficult. But there'll be many astonishing things with the current administration. So again, President Donald Trump doesn't have that loyalty. The same, yes, they obey him as commander in chief because the Constitution says they should, right? Right. The Constitution says they have to. But I and our republic is going to be 250 years today. So we've never had the likes of a Julius Caesar, right? We've never had the likes of a Julius Caesar. Yes, did the republic, the Roman Republic, survived for uh, over for 500 years before they had a Julius Caesar, a member of the Senate, a soldier, a general overthrow their powers, right? We're not quite there yet, and hey, you never know. So, in any event, this was just what I want to talk about today. I want to try and keep these videos short. I can continue in another discussion and just touch on things that I haven't had an opportunity to touch on today. But basically, James Madison, his thoughts were that the our the Congress was supposed to be the primary arm of government, have more power than the president. However, I'm going to just quickly clarify this. Over time, in practice, we've had presidents who showed, uh, that robustness in the executive and were strong-willed, and that started with, ironically, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was the opponent of Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. Alexander Hamilton was the one who advocated through the Federalist Papers and in his and being part of the first administration. He argued for a very strong central government, a very strong president. This was something he wanted. In fact, initially, he was advocating for a president who had life tenure. So he was elitist. He wanted something in the model of the British government, right? So did John Adams. This was something Thomas Jefferson was adamantly against. He wanted a weaker central government because he feared that a very strong executive president could usurp the powers of the state, could become a dictator. So he feared this, right? And so you see, these are fears, concerns people have today with President Donald Trump. But, people are still watching. As a historian, I don't see it in our history. We've had strong presidents, right? And it started, ironically, as I was saying, with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, who was against the president being so powerful, was the one who first started to exercise so much power, right? As a president, he was one who he executed the Louisiana Purchase without even going to Congress ahead of time, and he believed what he did was actually unconstitutional. But he thought it was a great opportunity. He couldn't waste time because everybody feared Napoleon. Napoleon was the greatest general, right? One of the greatest generals that ever lived in terms of strategy and tactics, right? The whole of Europe, all of European powers had to bond together to defeat him, right? And America feared, didn't want Napoleon to come and carve an empire in North America. So Napoleon needed money to keep waging his wars in Europe, and he offered to sell. You know, Thomas Jefferson had James Monroe, who later became our fifth president, to approach Napoleon, and of course we got Louisiana Purchase, and it basically doubled the size of America, right? And the Louisiana Purchase included land from the Mississippi uh, River and Rocky Mountains, however, not the Ohio Valley River. The Ohio Valley River we obtained through the by 1783 after the British gave that up. But that was part of what the British went to war with the French uh, for during the 7 Year War, right, between 17 uh, you know 56 and sorry 1756 to 1763, yes, which was what literally bankrupted England, Great Britain, and so they started imposing taxes, oppressive taxes, which caused the founding fathers, to rebel, right, to protest and to rebel. No taxation without representation. So, well, Thomas Jefferson was one of those early presidents who actually started to exercise very robust uh, power, right? Very the dynamic nature of the office. Um, Something else that so after him, uh, and he solidified the Democratic Republican Party. By the way, we've had a one party system before, right? We had a one party era. There was a de facto one party system before, and so knowing the history of the United States, it allows me to be sympathetic with modern, new, uh, just emerging democratic states like my country of origin, Nigeria. So, Nigeria is just over 60 years, but America has also gone through its struggles, right? We did not start off perfectly. Till today, we're not perfect. And so people have to be very patient and understanding that, look, America had its struggles in its beginnings. When we think of a one party system, right, one party state like China, it's inappropriate to automatically consider them as despotic or authoritarian, right? Because America, we've been through a one party state before. In fact, at the time we started, we didn't have parties, and George Washington ran on unopposed. He was elected unanimously, and he didn't want us to have parties, right? And after him, during the from the time of Thomas Jefferson, his Democratic Republican Party basically would later on go on to be the only party, right? From the time of President James Monroe, in fact, it will become the only party, right? So, in fact, when it will be the only party in the republic in our nation, that's a Democratic Republican Party. Its rival, the Federalist Party, founded by uh, Alexander Hamilton, would start to decline with the unfortunate death of Alexander Hamilton, its founder, in a duel. And of course, after the War of 1812, that's the Second War of Independence, which we fought against the British. There was these nationalist feelings, and so Americans saw the Federalist Party as some kind of fifth columnist, as a traitor party, because there were nationalist feelings at the time. And the reason is because the Federalist parties, their founders, they were Anglophiles, right? Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, they were openly Anglophile. They favored the British, but we fought a war against the British again in 1812, which we often call our Second World War of Independence. The reason we fought them was because of impressment. The British was fighting with Napoleon, and the British would just seize Americans in on merchant ships on the seas, and they'd impress them. That means they turned them into British soldiers to fight wars against Napoleon, sometimes even against America, because Britain still didn't see Americans as independents. They were still seeing America as being subjects of Great Britain. So that's the reason why we call it our Second World of Independence, and to let them know that no, 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 we're gone. We've totally broken away from the British Empire. We're no longer British subjects. We're now Americans. We're independent. So we fought that war. So that also led to the annihilation of the Federalist Party, and so we find the Democratic Republican Party was basically the only party that was left, and we had de facto one party system. So that was called the era of good feelings, right? There was prosperity at the time. America was now becoming expansionist, right? We were expanding westwards. Um, there was prosperity. And so we call it the era of good feelings. And there was just one party, as I said, the Democratic Republican Party. In fact, in 1824, all the presidential candidates came from one party, the Democratic Republican Party. And that's where, Andrew Jackson, uh, John Quincy Adams, who was our the son of John Adams, Henry Clay, he was from Kentucky. He had been Speaker of the House at the time from Kentucky, and there was a guy called William Crawford. So all four of them were from the Democratic Republican Party. So we had a one-party system at that time, and of course Andrew Jackson won a plurality of votes, but not the majority. And Henry Clay, who came last, eventually gave all his votes to um, John Quincy Adams. And so Congress, under the 12th Amendment, was the one that cast the vote, and they voted for John Quincy Adams. And after John Quincy Adams was elected president through a congressional vote, of course, he appointed Henry Clay as Secretary of State, and that's why uh, um, Andrew Jackson would go on to label the event as a corrupt bargain, right? So I've done a video, or you could find that on my YouTube, I guess, of the corrupt bargains. No, sorry, I think it's on my Facebook. So if you want to see about the three corrupt bargains that we've had in our, presidential annals, we call them the corrupt bargains. Um, but I digress. So basically, uh, we've had presidents, right, who were gradually exercising more power, more dominance, appear to be more dominant than the uh, than Congress, right? They make the executive seem more powerful than Congress. And it started with Thomas Jefferson. It moved due to the era of good feelings when we had one de facto one party system. And then with the Jacksonian era, Andrew Jackson, right? And then we broke up again into two parties because Andrew Jackson created his party. He and Martin Van Buren created the Democratic Party, which is the Democratic Party we still have today. They have their moniker as the jackass or the donkey because Andrew Jackson's rivals had disparaged him as being like a jackass, right? So we still have so that's the reason why the Democratic Party still has the moniker as the mascot as the donkey, right? So yeah, so you know. More than one party emerged again. We had a multi-party system, at least two-party system emerged again. So Andrew Jackson exercised very power. He was a very strong-willed president. So we see he was defying the other arms of government. He was very powerful. He had sway over Congress. So he exerted robust executive authority. So that was a very strong-willed party. We see how he defied even the Chief Justice John Marshall in Worcester versus Georgia. I've done a video discussing that, so I don't want to get into it. And he was able to get Congress to pass the force bill to prevent the so that the federal government could use the military to enforce federal laws in states, specifically with respect to South Carolina that had created the nullifier party and was threatening to secede over tariffs that it called tariffs of abominations, oppressive tariffs. So we've had these strong-willed presidents, of course, and of course we had Abraham Lincoln. We had James Polk. James Polk went to Congress to declare war against Mexico, by the way. I think, in fact, Congress may have declared war formally, maybe just by 5 times, right? So they declared war under James Madison against the British. They declared war, against Mexico under President James Polk. So we've had and James Polk expanded. He's the president, our 11th president, who he had been a protege of Andrew Jackson, by the way, and he achieved all items on his agenda, including limiting himself to just one term. In fact, he tried to have it made into law that president would not exceed one term. So he achieved all items on his agenda. Uh, he succeeded in doing that. There are four items. He succeeded in achieving all those four items. So we've had these very strong presidents that made the public, American public, identify with the president more than they do with Congress. And of course, in modern times, we find all Americans vote for the president. So we have that emotional, that attachment, right? That loyalty, that attachment to our president, not to members of Congress, right? How many people know our senators? We don't know a lot of senators. And senators, many senators have had office for over 30 years, right? Joe Biden, I think, had office for a long time as a senator. Many other senators. Of course, our president is limited to two terms, right? So they can't do more than two terms, right? That's with the passing of the 22nd Amendment, because FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, 32nd president, was the only one who had four terms. And after him, we limited the terms of our president in office. So, but the American public is, the president is voted for by all Americans, right? So Americans sort of have that emotional attachment to the president. And I guess that, he's the one the media is concerned about. He's the one who sets the national agenda, the State of the Union. So everybody pays attention to the president. And so also because um, the power of the executive is unified in the person of the president. There's so many things he can do, and our president has been dynamic and sort of like a Roman emperor, right? The Roman emperor, the Roman consul was very dynamic, but the emperor, we recall by the time of Augustus Caesar, uh, the Senate, right, which we still have, right, the legislative body, in the time of the Romans, they were made of the patricians. They were just a notional body that the emperor controlled. They had no real power. Uh, Augustus Caesar arrogated all powers to himself, right? So they had these, nominal figureheads, but they still bowed down, and they took directives from the emperor Augustus, who was very happy to just pull the strings from behind, right? So legislative, judicial, executive power was all embodied, personified in Augustus Caesar. He called himself Parens Patria, father of his country, and he was princeps, the first citizen. So many things. He was a tribune of the people, so he was the benefactor of the people. So he arrogated all power to himself. Our president is limited by two terms. Americans have an emotional attachment, the bonding and the media, the public with our president, but our president is still very limited. And, so again, Congress can theoretically, on paper, in text, they could still curtail his powers, right? They could still limit his powers. They could still remove the president. And despite the fact that, yes, our president, in a way, is almost modeled after a Roman emperor. But, an emperor rules for life unless he's killed, right? And our president has these limitations, right? The two terms, and people still have to vote for the president. The emperor was not voted for. So things have changed dramatically since the times of the Romans. But this was just to frame the conversation from the philosophy of James Madison, who's called father of our Constitution. He studied the classics extensively. He studied the Greeks as well. Um, the Greeks, of course, are the creators of democracy. Uh, Demos, meaning the people. Kratos means power, so power of the people. But if you study the Greeks, you find out that democracy didn't mean everybody was voting. No, a significant amount of people that were eligible, usually the wealthy Greeks, right, were those who could vote, who could participate, the wealthy Greek families, right? And so it's interesting that Plato himself, one of the books I'm reading now, and I started reading it while I was detained. I didn't include it. So some books I didn't finish. I didn't include it in my list of books. I did a video in discussing the list of books, just itemizing the list of books that I read while wrongfully detained in Montgomery County, Maryland. I read about 100 books, very significant books, somewhere, trashy, but I read about 100 books. I didn't mention that I was reading The Republic by Plato. So I'm actually reading it now. So I'm going to focus on finishing that book. Um, so Plato actually did not like democracy. So it's kind of interesting because, and you can see where our founding fathers got their notions of the uh, the masses, the populace that can be easily swayed by a demagogue. I was a member of the of the elite class, right? This was what Plato thought of. He thought that, the masses should not have the vote because they were not able to think properly, right? Only educated people would be able to think properly and exercise their votes properly, and they would not be easily manipulated by a member of by a self-interested member of the elite class, right? So you can see this is where James Madison and Alexander Hamilton got their notions from. And so I'm going to stop this video here. So education is very important to America, and there's ample opportunity for people to be educated now. Of course, no one's going to force an American citizen who has opportunities to educate himself to an exceptional degree right now with the internet, with artificial intelligence and everything available to us, the tools available to us. As they say, you can take a horse to the river, but you can't force the horse to drink from the river. So um, Alexander Hamilton and the rest of our founding fathers, they took themselves to the river. They definitely drank from the river. They were highly educated. And of course, they wanted, the American citizens' education to be available to the public so we would be better citizens. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents. And I also drew attention to color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts, that's caused my constitutional rights to be violated in Montgomery County, Maryland, under a corrupt judge superintending the abuses and defamation against me by Montgomery County, Maryland, in order to obstruct justice. The judge is Judge James Bonifant, a corrupt, racist, and xenophobic judge who's committed fraud on the courts, defamed me, and violated my constitutional rights. My Fourth Amendment rights were violated. My Sixth Amendment rights have been violated. My 14th Amendment rights have been violated. I've done videos and written about these abuses, and you could pay attention to the abuse of, the miscarriage of justice going on in Montgomery County, Maryland. I was abused and swatted by Montgomery County police. They committed a robbery under color of law. A police officer, Jeffrey Ray, shot me in the head. There was no arrest warrant. I'm a law-abiding American citizen. I was working in the federal government as of May 16, 2023, when I was assaulted and swatted in my own home. I was almost killed, and then to add insult to injury, I was wrongfully arrested. And the judge took my job from me, placing me under arrest, locking me up for 15 months without a trial. This is America, and we're seeing that atrocities happen in America as well, like a third world country. Please pay attention. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.